no, I'm not denying.
Of course, how can someone who rejects the faith be in the church if there's a unity of faith?
In exactly the same way that a person who commits robbery or commits slander or commits gossip or any other of the sins that we commit, sin against chastity or adultery, remains in the church even though he has committed a sin.
How about this quote? What do you think of this? Pope Leo XIII, Satis Cognito number 9. If anyone holds to a single one of these heresies, he is not a Catholic.
Well, I'd have to know what the heresies were listed, because, again, I certainly agree that if a person holds the heresy, say, that the Catholic Church is not the one true church, that would be equivalent to a formal denunciation of the entire nature of the church, and that would be a formal, in my opinion, would be a formal type of divorce, as I've been using.
Well, Benedict XVI holds that. He holds that the leading pastors, quote, the bishops of the Greek Schismatic Orthodox are in the church. He calls them pastors in the Church of Christ. So he fits the very criteria you've just specified.
Yeah. There's a problem, of course, there. And the problem, of course, is what would be called, perhaps, sometimes called in law, the best evidence rule. The evidence upon which one is basing these charges against the claimants to the papacy is not necessarily valid. In other words, I attribute to you enough goodwill to believe that you believe you're quoting correctly. I do not accept that these quotes are valid.
So you think that that's not an accurate quotation? That's what you're trying to say?
I think it's a very high probability it's not a valid quotation.
Okay, well...
It's English, that is.
These are quotes from the official Vatican newspaper.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm not doubting that at all.
Okay, and anyone can verify them on the internet. Okay, Benedict XVI, joint declaration with Schismatic Patriarch Bartholomew. This is a leader of a non-Catholic sect. November 30th, 2006, and he says, quote, this commitment, he says some other things, and then he says, this commitment comes from the Lord's will and from our responsibility as pastors in the Church of Christ, end quote. He lavishes praises on their schismatic sects all the time. He says he loves their sect, calls them venerable, talks about how much he esteems it, how much he respects it. John Paul II gave a donation to a schismatic sect. They give communion, or they teach that they may receive communion. But he says clearly, in plain language, in the Vatican newspaper, anyone can verify it's not a fallacious quote. He says, from our responsibility as pastors in the Church of Christ. So he's not only saying that the leading schismatic bishop is in the church, which is formal heresy, but he's saying that he's a pastor in the church, which means that he has jurisdiction, some authority. So, I mean, to deny that is simply apostasy. It's simply to be an utter liar and a heretic, to deny that he believes this. What would you say?
I say that I don't necessarily deny it. I say there is no convincing proof.
There's no what?
No convincing proof.
Okay, so that's not convincing.
Here, follow my point. You use the expression our and we, those words, a couple of times, which, of course, is, reading from the quotation. As you're aware, in English, the word we sometimes refers to the person you're speaking to. Sometimes it doesn't. It's the old thing about, the guy goes into a bar and says, give us a drink, and, the bartender says, what do you got, a mouse in your pocket? Well, what we are we referring to? In some languages, the word we and us is translated, or are translated, by two separate words, including the person spoken to, not including the person spoken to. When those languages are translated into English, or vice versa, a terrible mistake can be made because you don't have that distinction. So once again, if I say the word we, I may be including you, I may not. There's no way in English to tell in and of itself. These are English translations, I presume, perhaps from Latin, perhaps from German. Maybe in those languages they have different pronouns, and that can lead to a terrible misunderstanding. That's number one. Any translation is subject to errors, goodwill errors, or because of the lack of a correspondence of an exact same word, a situation where a misunderstanding can take place through no error. Number two, although I don't believe with it totally, Malachi Martin, who I think you might be familiar with, who was a laicized Jesuit and wrote a great deal on the papacy, and who died a while back ago, put out a thing about John Paul II. And he essentially declared that John Paul II was the prisoner of the Vatican. He said that John Paul II was constantly writing really orthodox encyclicals, but his secretaries were ripping them up, rephrasing them, and issuing under his name. Now, I found that sort of silly. But the point is, at least one person in the field believed that this was factually correct. And therefore, most, if not all of the things attributed to John Paul II were incorrectly attributed to John Paul II. That is, the negative ones. I do know for a fact, or at least I trust completely, a fellow who attended a papal talk when John Paul II was in St. Louis. I don't remember what year. And he heard John Paul II say in English, in his own presence, while he was in the church, that there was no salvation outside the church. Now, publicly, I never saw that anywhere.
Yeah, maybe I can respond.
What? Yeah, sure. Go
okay.
ahead.
That, yeah, I have to say that what you've been saying is absurd. We have the Latin text of Vatican II. It teaches the same heresies. The Vatican issues its own translations. He says this in basically every speech, every other week almost. Okay, we post his heresy of the week. He's constantly praising the schismatic Orthodox. To assert that these are all mistranslations is insanity and ridiculous. As far as John Paul II goes, I've read all of his encyclicals. Brother Michael's read every Vatican newspaper copy of the L'Osservatore Romano going back to 1968. Okay, it's everywhere in their writings. It's constant religious indifferentism, respect for false religions, okay, heresy after heresy after heresy. He never taught that you have to be Catholic to be saved. That's just not true. And even if he said it once, it doesn't matter. Pope Pius VI pointed out that heretics always contradict themselves. They always use ambiguity. It doesn't justify all kinds of utterances of heresy here and there. And John Paul II, I mean, his public actions are clear. They're on videotape. He committed total apostasy in Assisi, inviting all the different representatives of the false religions, animists, Buddhists, Hindus, allowed them to preach, basically prayed with them, saying how much, we all respect one another. This is apostasy, and it's explicitly condemned by Pope Pius XI in Mortalium Animos, 1928 encyclical. He says that those who engage in this kind of activity are apostates, that this activity is apostasy from the faith of Christ. And contrary to what you were saying earlier, apostates are outside the church. That's a teaching of the church. He prayed with African animists. Okay, he constantly had these. He venerated Gandhi. He prayed in the mosque. Okay, he went into the synagogue and bowed his head as the Jews prayed for the coming of their Messiah. He went into the Buddhist patriarch and visited him in the Buddhist temple and bowed right in front of the statue of Buddha and exchanged gifts. I taught that we shouldn't convert non-Catholics, entered into agreements with the leading schismatics that we shouldn't convert them, taught that there are saints and martyrs in non-Catholic religions, approved the Vatican's Balamon statement with the Orthodox, anyone can find it on the Internet, which explicitly rejects converting them. It says it's outdated, and on and on and on. He approved the Vatican-Lutheran agreement on justification, so he's a heretic. Anyone who would say that he's not a heretic is just a liar once he's seen the evidence. And frankly, it's just Protestantism. But I wanted you to just clarify what you were saying earlier. So you were saying earlier that if someone knows about the Council of Trent and comes to you and says, Vin, I want to convert, but I don't believe in the Council of Trent because the Vatican Lutheran Agreement says that it no longer applies to the Lutherans. I believe in faith alone. You said that person could become a Catholic and would enter the church.
No, I'm sorry. I should have said could not. That might have been a slip of the tongue. Certainly, if anybody baptized in there, it would have been sacrilege. What I tried to do was draw a distinction between an infant and an adult.
So, but by what authority would you say that he would not become a member if he's just following what John Paul II and Benedict XVI did?
Oh, because we are for two reasons. One is he would be being self-contradictory. And self-contradictory and a rational person could not be accepted as virtuous. And two, we're not obligated to follow what is reported with John Paul II and anybody else when he's wrong. again, I come back down to it, if I may. I've been involved several times with the mass media. I've been involved with press people. I've been involved with press releases. And despite the fact that I have given out, at times, extremely detailed press releases, I have read in the newspaper something quite different than what I gave out.